Is that working, Kelly?
Yep, that looks great, Jen.
Okay. Um, good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. I feel like compelled to comment on the weather. I'm sitting in Washington, D.C., and it's cloudy. Anyway, thank you for the privilege of your time. And I also want to thank Kelly Spring and her colleagues, Matt and others, for giving us a chance to present our new book project to this group. My name is Jan Lambertz, and I'm a historian and editor at the Research Center of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. And unfortunately, I have to start with a disclaimer, which is the opinions I'm expressing here are my own and not necessarily those of the museum. We're going to speak today about an essay collection, as Kelly said, that's about to appear with Wayne State University Press next month. And the book, which we've called More Than Parcels, focuses on food relief or care packages that were sent to Jewish prisoners in Nazi camps and ghettos during World War II as the Holocaust unfolded. It's not only about food relief, but also centrally about starvation, war, philanthropy, humanitarian work, and the Holocaust. I'm going to be giving a general overview of the project and mentioning some of our key findings, and then my co-editor, Jan Láníček in Sydney, will offer you a closer case study from the book that looks particularly at the story in London and Britain during the war. So how did we get interested in this project? I want to begin with some numbers that really caught our attention. In the year leading up to March 1941, the Postal Service in the ghetto in the city of Łódź, or also known as Lodz or Litzmannstadt, reportedly handled over 135,000 domestic parcels and over 14,000 packages from abroad, along with more than 1 million letters and postcards. Sorry. In the Warsaw Ghetto, in the second half of July 1941, 4 months later, over 100,000 letters and cards were delivered and over 54,000 parcels. In January 1942, over 33,000 small parcels came into the Warsaw Ghetto. These numbers are at first glance quite shocking, and just as shocking to us perhaps is that we actually have numbers at all. No records like these survive for most Nazi ghettos, for camps or prisons. Our only clues are often the many repeated requests made for food parcels in letters and telegrams that Jews trapped in Europe sent to their relatives, friends, and relief agencies elsewhere. These numbers really got our attention. So what do we make of this story of hundreds of thousands of parcels? Why is it important? We decided to explore the significance of these packages more systematically and broadly by drawing on the expertise of people who are working on different cases. And we brought together a group of 10 or 12 historians to create a kind of world map of some of the major parcel relief schemes that were organized for Jewish prisoners in wartime Europe. I should add, we specifically looked at packages and not at the question of mail more generally, which is an important topic. And we're hoping that other projects will continue investigating the whole topic of prisoner mail. What was allowed, what was censored? Could Jewish prisoners correspond with the outside world, and until what point in the war? We didn't cover every case and country in this study, but we aimed for a wide geographical reach and looked for examples that covered different periods in the war. And in the end, we settled on 11 different case studies. 6 of them focus on relief that was organized through allied and neutral states, particularly in Europe. such as the UK, Sweden, and of course, Switzerland. We also included 2 studies of Jews who were living under regimes that were friendly with or aligned with Nazi Germany. In one case, Transnistria, where a lot of Romanian Jews were deported under Antonescu's rule. And we also have a case study from Vichy, France. Finally, we brought together 3 cases of ghettos in territory that was directly under Nazi occupation. In this case, Theresienstadt, the large ghetto in Warsaw, and some of those ghettos and labor camps around Krakow. The case studies zoom in on some of the major Jewish philanthropies that had an international reach, such as the Joint Distribution Committee and the World Jewish Congress. We also found it critical, however, to reconstruct some of the less remembered and more informal efforts made by thousands of individuals on both sides of the Atlantic and even deep in the interior of the Soviet Union. Eliana Adler, a historian at Penn State University, for instance, tracked the story of Polish Jews who had fled into the Soviet Union after the German and Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939. She found that refugees themselves both sent and received relief parcels over constantly shifting borders in the East. Even refugees in the Soviet Union under severe economic strain managed to support families back home in German-occupied Poland with parcels, or in some cases, family and friends who had ended up in the Soviet prison system in the Gulag. Another example taken from our collection is the work done by Anne Lepper, who's a young historian in Berlin. And she studied one of the important agencies that orchestrated aid from Geneva, Switzerland. She looked at an organization called RELICO, the Relief Committee for the War-Stricken Jewish Population. This was a parcels project created in late 1939 by a Polish Jewish refugee and it was loosely attached to the World Jewish Congress, though operated largely independently. Using a combination of informal couriers and the rather shaky wartime postal system, Relico managed to find sponsors across the globe. They purchased and delivered tens of thousands of food packages to Jewish communities and prisoners in occupied territory, mainly Poland. Gerald Steinacher, who now teaches at the University of Nebraska, revisited the work of the Wartime International Red Cross in Geneva and looked at what it actually organized for tens of thousands of civilian prisoners in a range of concentration camps. Pontus Rudberg takes up the complex organizational work that was conducted in Sweden during the war, the combined efforts made by Jewish communities, individuals, the state, and the Swedish Red Cross. Laurie Drake, a Canadian historian, looked at how Jews in a range of internment camps in southern occupied France, such as Gurs and Rives-Salt, organized food aid shipments. Many of these internees were foreign-born refugees who had fled to France from both Eastern and Western Europe. And because these camps were often created in very isolated rural settings in southern France, their prisoners found it extremely difficult to obtain outside aid, local aid, or support from their scattered families. And she examines what kind of food aid projects they put together on their own devices. Some of our authors, as I said, also looked at parcel relief sent to people in the largest ghettos in occupied Poland. Clearly, more research needs to be done on what was possible in smaller ghettos or ghettos that only existed for a very short time before being violently dissolved. On the one hand, these examples show the resilience of family ties and neighborhood networks in a time of extreme existential distress. On the other hand, our authors in this section show that relief work in captive communities also exposed and caused bitter divisions again and again, solidarity and altruism came into conflict with self-preservation. Jan Láníček in Sydney, as I said, will discuss another example taken from aid activities, from aid activists, refugees, and the government in parcel schemes in Britain. As you might guess, a long chain of obstacles tripped up these projects and added to the desperation of Jewish prisoners and communities. These difficulties shadowed every stage of organizing food parcels. There's no single overarching timeline that applies equally to all the parcel projects analyzed by our contributors. For some, it was the entry of the United States into the war that derailed all their plans and future work. For others, it was the violent closing down of ghettos in Eastern Europe and mass deportations of their residents to killing centers. Every shift in war conditions, combatants and governments and border policies demanded new risk assessments about where and whether food packages could be sent. And even before shipments were assembled, aid activists and volunteers had to monitor new export license rules and currency regulations, both of which changed constantly. The availability of food items also changed constantly, whether it was sardines from Portugal, a popular item, or semolina, cheese and vegetable paste from Yugoslavia or Romania. In an attempt to starve Germany of resources, as many of you know, the British and later the Americans imposed a wartime blockade of food and other goods for most of continental Europe. And as a result, these organizations had to do their bulk food shopping in the neutral countries that still had some kind of trade operating with Axis territory. Once sent off, the parcels faced new enemies, as you can imagine. These included bombing of warehouses and transport routes, delays of many months, and losses from spoilage and poor packing materials. The whims and pilfering of German and Nazi officials further disrupted their long journey to Jewish communities and Nazi detention sites. Monitoring the arrival and distribution of the packages on the ground in Europe remained almost impossible, even where trustworthy couriers and partners did exist. These hurdles around parcels persisted until the final days of the war. But I want to return once more to the opening question I asked: why is this story important? First, overall, we see that charities, relatives, friends, and caring volunteers shipped a stream of relief, particularly food aid, to Jews trapped in Nazi camps and ghettos for most of the war, although this occurred at very uneven intervals and was often cut off very abruptly. Some people sent relief directly through their post offices. Others paid Jewish agencies to make those arrangements. Food parcels, if they arrived, played a critical role during the war in prolonging life for Jews in all corners of the Nazi Empire. They also helped to maintain morale, reminding prisoners that someone out there cared about them and hadn't forgotten them. Recent histories of wartime rescue efforts are certainly important. They remind us that a handful of really courageous activists risked their lives by hiding Jewish families, leading Jews to safety under dangerous conditions, or securing, even forging, precious visas and travel documents for refugees. But our parallel story of food shipments is no less important. Individuals, Jewish communities, and philanthropic agencies made hundreds of thousands of interventions on behalf of Jews trapped in Europe during the war. They understood something of the dangers that lay ahead. So the line between relief and rescue remains very blurred. But if we regard widespread, deliberate starvation of Jewish prisoners as one major feature of the Holocaust, not just a prelude to it, then even a modest food parcel must also count as a form of rescue. It's important to write the history not only of extraordinary heroism during the war, but also of the very ordinary aid efforts made by thousands of people. Second, we can use the story of Parcels to address a central historical puzzle about these years. What was known about the events we now call the Holocaust as it unfolded? Historians have answered this question in many different ways, from many different perspectives. We can argue that the traffic in relief parcels and prisoner requests for such aid partly, even greatly, contributed to the flow of informal information about the lethal nature of Nazi detention sites to the outside world. Where parcels did succeed in getting through, they became a key means of transmitting some very fragmentary news about the location, living conditions, and fate of Jewish prisoners to families, humanitarians, and Jewish groups scattered across the globe. Finally, how can we as historians measure success or failure in this story? How many parcels arrived or were instead just confiscated, pillaged, and consumed by a vast network of jailers and corrupt officials along the way? How many were stockpiled in the storerooms of concentration camps and never distributed until after liberation? For many, obviously, simply too little, too late. These questions are hard to answer, hard to reconstruct. Aid activists themselves experimented with a range of methods to obtain confirmation that parcels had arrived where intended. They initially used test shipments and package receipt postcards to provide clues. These signed, stamped, or initialed receipt cards ultimately remained highly ambiguous documents throughout the war. They were difficult to read and difficult to interpret, but receipts ultimately became an important bargaining chip for food relief organizers who were facing uncooperative Allied officials. The very absence of delivery confirmations could be cause for Allied governments to refuse export licenses, refuse space for parcels on ships and trains, refuse to supply replacement tires for delivery trucks, or refuse to free up funds for renewed relief shipments. Let me conclude my overview with a few more comments. Food parcels could clearly prolong life, but could not do so indefinitely. Some exceptions stand out. Our contributors, Stefan Ionesco, who writes about Theresienstadt, makes a strong case that parcels had a serious, he writes about Transnistria, and Sylvia Goldbaum-Fracapani, who looked at a group of Danish Jews in Theresienstadt, both make a strong case that parcels had a serious positive impact on survival rates in certain locations. A few of our authors raised the question of whether stockpiled undistributed parcels at sites such as liberated concentration camps in 1945 played a significant role in prisoner survival right after liberation, especially when the Allied armies had not fully prepared for the massive humanitarian crisis that awaited them. Still, the consensus of most of our authors is that even the massive infusion of parcels into a few detention sites and a few Jewish communities could never have halted the mass Jewish death that took place under Nazi rule. Food parcels only put death on hold for a little while, a few weeks, a few more months. Most arrived too late, after most of the Jews in Europe had been deported or already killed. But more is at stake in this history than just an account of successes and terrible failures. My colleagues on this project demonstrate the centrality of individual ingenuity and generosity in extending Jewish lives during the war. We still possess only a highly fragmented record of Nazi-era relief work who had access to parcels or any kind of mail in ghettos, concentration camps, or in the tens of thousands of forced labor camps in the German Reich and beyond. What special restrictions applied to Jewish prisoners? And there are many other questions that remain to be explored, and we hope that our book and our project spurs further research into all of these topics. Thank you for your time, and I'm now going to turn it over to Jan Láníček.
Okay, thank you, Jan, and I hope you can all hear me and that it will work well with the connection from Australia, which is quite far away. So good late evening from Australia, and thanks for offering the overview. What I will do, and I will try to be relatively short, I hope, is to at the beginning, I would like to do two things. At the beginning, just to emphasize some of the key points that Jan already made with some examples, and then also to talk briefly about my chapter in the volume, which I contributed as well, and which offers examination of one particular case study, but also tries to offer some broader conclusion. So in general, I started working on this project about 15 years ago, when during my research of Czechoslovak government in exile, I came across repeatedly documents which kind of surprised me as a Holocaust historian, because they demonstrated kind of existence of connection and of shipments of food to various concentration camps and ghettos in Nazi Europe, something which hasn't been really described in historiography. So in this case, an example of a receipt of a parcels in plural, sent from Lisbon and Istanbul in Theresienstadt. And what is kind of surprising is another example from Theresienstadt, wrapping from a parcel containing tins of sardines sent from Lisbon to Theresienstadt as well. But what's surprising is that these shipments of parcels did not go only to places which were used by the Nazis in their propaganda, as Theresienstadt as the model ghetto, which the Nazis said that the Jews live there peacefully and are not subjected to any persecution, but that these parcels were actually sent also to some of the worst examples of what we connect with the Holocaust, such as Auschwitz-Birkenau. So we have examples of tens of thousands of parcels with sardines, but also with other items, bread, potatoes, being sent not only from Nazi Europe, but also from outside of Nazi Europe to Auschwitz-Birkenau. This one is from Lisbon, from Portugal. And more and more I kept exploring the topic, I realized, and I often use this kind of the comparison or this kind of statement, that basically almost everyone in Europe is sending parcels. Some people send one parcel, a couple of parcels. Some of them develop more extensive programs of supporting individuals or family members or their communities in ghettos. Another example from Auschwitz-Birkenau, where one Greek Jewish prisoner confirmed the receipt of parcels from Switzerland, and which shows that even in Auschwitz-Birkenau, people could receive parcels, although those are rather exceptions, and this is not like to claim that thousands of prisoners in Auschwitz could receive food parcels. That would be a wrong claim. But we have a number of examples of individuals who, against all odds and suffering from their own deprivation, collected funds and tried to support the individuals and kind of whole networks of people in ghettos and camps with shipments of food. So this couple of German Jewish refugees from Denmark, they sent a lot of parcels to their networks in camps. Another example from Prague, occupied Czechoslovakia, this young gentleman with his friends sent several tons of food from Prague to Theresienstadt, but also to Auschwitz-Birkenau, also to Lodz ghetto in occupied Poland. And it just shows how widespread these activities were during the Second World War. Obviously, you have more organized efforts, such as the American Joint Jewish Distribution Committee, financed from the fundraising among American Jewish communities, so in very strong financial position, which supports a lot of these activities from Portugal, from Switzerland, from Turkey, and other places, especially in the second half of the Second World War, although in the first half as well. And so now, very briefly, I'm conscious of the time, about what my chapter in the volume is trying to do. There are three main questions which I would like to outline very briefly, which I kind of try to address in the contribution. And the first one was to ask the question: what was actually known outside of Nazi Germany about the situation of the Jews, not in the terms of the Holocaust in the final phase of the final solution, but in terms of the kind of material situation they experienced, especially a lack of access to food and associated diseases caused by malnutrition, and how much it was actually known outside of Germany. Second, once this information became available, what the activists, especially Jewish activists, but also representatives of exile governments, those who represented the communities under Nazis, what they tried to do and what were the main obstacles they faced when they tried to support those in the Nazi ghettos or concentration camps. And the third question was, and something which Jan already mentioned, if it's even possible to establish how many parcels were sent from these kind of from outside of Nazi Germany to these camps and ghettos, where they were sent and how many were delivered, and what was the significance, not only material but also psychological, for both senders and addressees or recipients of these parcels. So first of all, it's clear from the documents that we have available that people outside of Europe were informed about the first early stage, so-called final solution, and that they received information in a variety of ways about the Jewish predicament in the ghettos and early concentration camps. And those could come in the form of letters or cards sent by deportees, and I have some examples in the slide which you can take a look at. And when they informed them about the very difficult material situation in Eastern Europe, in the ghettos, and very often actually directly asked for some form of support which would help them kind of improve their situation or their condition in the ghettos. Then there were also, let's say, Jewish activists. Many of them managed to escape from Europe early during the war, from Poland via the Soviet Union or in different ways, and finally got to London or to the United States. And they first of all had first-hand, let's say, experience with the situation under the Nazis. Their communities, friends, family members were in those ghettos or camps, and they tried to inform the so-called free world about the Jewish predicament and tried to kind of push Allied governments to support some relief program that would send food parcels or any other relief parcels to to the ghettos in Eastern Europe. And one of the most famous publications in this case is by Zorak Barhaftik, who escaped from Poland to the United States, and in 1943 published a book, Starvation Over Europe, where he kind of provided evidence about how especially the Jews are being persecuted in terms of lack of access to food, and what it means in terms of starvation. And another quote from the book, he emphasizes this element. Another example I have from the New York Times, and this article, this report was even discussed in U.S. Senate. Starvation of Jewish communities in Europe. Another refugee from Poland who had first-hand experience and who's kind of lobbying support of the Jewish community with the relief parcels that they need to be sent to make sure that the Jewish community is able to survive. And obviously, this is before the Nazis kind of crossed the line, persecution and mass extermination of gas chambers or mass shootings in Eastern Europe. So clearly there was enough information even published already during the war. Obviously, in response to the information, as I mentioned, these activists lobbied for some programs, which, however, was very difficult to kind of execute. The main obstacle, if I mentioned that, that there were some major obstacles, the main obstacle on the way of sending relief was that the British government and British army, from the very beginning of the war, posed blockade of continental Europe with the aim to break Nazi Germany economically, and which prohibited import in Europe of any items which could kind of support the Nazi regime, and food items were obviously on that list as well, apart from other, let's say, military equipment. And that meant that also prisoners in concentration camps, unless they were considered prisoners of war of the Allied countries, in that case they could receive food parcels from the International Committee of the Red Cross, but the Jews were not considered prisoners of war, which meant that they were not allowed to receive this support from outside of Europe, and the British were quite strictly adhering to the blockade until the end of the war. Only once information about mass extermination of the Jews in the second half of 1942 became available, the British made some ad hoc concessions and allowed British and Czech and Polish Jewish organizations and governments to send a very limited amount of money. Portugal, £3,000 a month, which was more than £3,000 now, still relatively small amount, or later the US government allowed $12,000 per month to be sent to Portugal, and from Portugal that they can buy local produce, mostly fish, tins of fish, or some nuts or jams, and they could be sent to the camps or ghettos. And clearly, the British made it clear from the very beginning that this is a limited concession, that this doesn't challenge the blockade of Europe of any sense of the British were trying to impose it, and that this is a quote from July 1944. So at the point when basically most of the victims of the Holocaust had already been murdered by the Nazi regime, still the British say that obviously this is a limited program, and that the rest of them will have to wait with patience and bravery for the day of liberation, which tells us something also about how the British perceive the Nazi persecution of the Jews at this particular time. There were also other conditions. There was actually a long list of conditions that the senders of the relief from Portugal had to comply with, and was very difficult. One of them was, for example, that all the parcels had to be addressed individually to individual persons. That it was not possible to send group shipments. So it meant that these organizers had to kind of maintain a very detailed card index, up-to-date card index in the conditions of the war, which was obviously almost impossible. Also, as Jan mentioned, at some point, for example, the US government insisted on receipts for individual parcels from the recipient in the ghettos, which obviously was also impossible to execute. So fortunately, the Americans eventually dropped this demand. Just very briefly, I am aware of the time, and I want to leave some time for questions, or kind of we can discuss some of the topics about the places from where parcels, at least in terms of what I studied, were sent. These are the green dots from Portugal, later also from Switzerland, Turkey, and Sweden in the framework of the programs that I studied. And the red dots are places where they're actually addressed to. So mostly in Central Eastern Europe, the large one is Theresienstadt, as I mentioned, the special, which there was access to more information, and also seemed that was more likely that the parcels would be delivered. In fact, 280,000 parcels, half a kilo each, were sent from these places to Theresienstadt during the Second World War. At least that's what I came together by several organizations, but also several tens of thousands of parcels were sent to Auschwitz and Auschwitz-Birkenau, thousands also to what used to be Yugoslavia, Transnistria, some camps in Germany, and so on and so forth. In general, this is kind of example of one of these summary reports of parcels being sent. And you can see sardines, almonds, some fruit jams. This is all being sent from Portugal in 1943 to Polish ghettos. In terms of German approach, we know that the SS confiscated probably most of the parcels. At the same time, we know that they allowed at least some of them to reach the addressees for various reasons. One of them was that when they received it, that they were often asked to send a card to confirm that they received, which could kind of support the Nazi propaganda that the Jews are living perfectly fine and they are being supported and they are allowed to receive parcels. The other reason clearly was that if the SS wanted to confiscate the parcels, that they had to let at least some of them to arrive, because only that ensured that they kept coming after that. So they obviously took a cut, most of the parcels, but some of them allowed a receipt. This is, by the way, kind of interesting photo which I found an exhibition in one museum, which is a tin of sardines, which is used for chess set in Auschwitz. As I mentioned, often they were forced to send a receipt. Leo Beck, famous rabbi from Theresienstadt, sending confirmation. Final point, very briefly, what the shipments of food meant for senders and recipients or the addressees. Clearly, there was the value of receiving food, and which could temporarily improve the nutritional intake of the prisoners. At the same time, we also need to keep in mind that it had very important psychological meaning, not only for the recipients but also for the senders, because the senders often they kind of lived in England, in the United States. They knew that their family members, their communities suffer in Nazi Germany, and they were trying to find a way how to help. Once this became possible in the form of sending these food parcels, even though they knew that, or often knew, it was very unlikely that these parcels would be even delivered, they thought they should do something, and then at least feel that they are trying to help, they're trying to kind of cope with the inability to help. So at least in this form, they could support them, or they thought they could possibly support them to do their utmost to help. The same is the case with the recipients, because when they received the parcels, it was not only about the food, but also about the idea that somebody's been thinking about of them, that somebody wants to support them, somebody is sending them parcels from far away. Or one prisoner in Auschwitz remembers that she received a parcel with a loaf of bread in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and the sole fact that it was addressed in her name and not the prisoner number that was tattooed on her forearm immediately sort of revived the sense of humanity in her, because she could again see her own name, not only the number that she was forced to use in Auschwitz-Birkenau. So I would say there's really a lot that the volume as such can talk about, and I will stop here, and I hope that that you will eventually find your way, and will check what myself, Jen, and the rest of the team have written in the book. Thank you.